Your assignment this week is to draw and shade a sphere, a cube, and a cylinder. The reason is because if you can draw and shade these basic shapes, then you can draw and shade anything. To draw, we just mean to use lines to make the form look realistic, and by shading, we mean kind of coloring those lines in with darks and lights in order to make there be realistic looking light and shadow on the page. Let me show you some of the materials that I'm using. You might use any number of materials that are different than mine. But if you have materials like these, then that'll do just fine. So I have an eraser, I have a blending stump or a tortillon, and I've got some pencils. Notice that the pencils have different numbers on them and different letters. The H stands for hard, and the B stands for black. So if it's got a number like 2H, that means it's double hard, or 4B, it means it's quadruple black. The F stands for fine. In general, this assignment will go easier if you have a black pencil. So I've chosen a 6B or a 4B for this exercise. So the first thing we want to do is the sphere. Now you can use a compass like this one if you want, if you have such a thing, or you can just grab a random lid or something that's circular and trace it. That's easiest, so that's what I'm going to do. When you shade it after it's drawn, then you should know that there's a dark side away from a light source and a light side. So you need to imagine that there's a light bulb or a sun or something off to one side and maybe above the sphere, and then you can shade according to that imagined light source. Notice that the difference between the light side and the dark side is soft. There's no hard edge between the two. The reason is because that'll make it look more round. If you've got a hard edge, a non-blended edge, then suddenly it'll look lumpy and not round. Also notice that the line, the blended line really, between the light side and the dark side follows the form of the sphere. It's also round. There are no straight edges here, or it won't look realistic. When you start shading, you should shade with a light touch to begin with. You can always get darker. So you can shade really lightly, even on the dark side, and then start gradually adding darks on top of the shading you already put down. You can go over it with mini passes, using strokes that are however you want. They can follow the form or not, depending on whatever you think looks best. Eventually, you'll have a highlight and light shading around that highlight that gets darker and darker as it goes to the other side of the form. And you could stop right there if you want, or you can use a blending stump or a tortillon to smooth it out. If you don't have one of these, then you can use your finger, or you can use a paper towel, or you can experiment with different kinds of materials. As I am blending with this tortillon, I've noticed that it's a little bit too dark, so I can use an eraser and use the eraser and the tortillon together to make the whole thing look how I want it to look. Now, everything that I have done up until now is called a form shadow. It's shading on the form itself, the sphere itself. I'm also going to put down a cast shadow, a shadow that's going away from the light source towards the surface that the sphere, in this case, is resting on. Notice that when I draw the cast shadow, it's got different shading as well. It's dark next to the form, and it gets lighter as we move away from the form. Now, on the form shadow and on the cast shadow, there are different levels of shading that we can label. The highlight is like a reflection of the light source, and it's right in the middle of the lightest spot of the form. The darkest spot of the form shading is called the core shadow, or the edge shadow. Notice that I didn't put the edge shadow on the very bottom of the sphere. Instead, it gets a little bit lighter as it goes around the sphere towards the bottom. That's because there is reflected light bouncing from the table or the surface onto the back side of the form. There is, on the light side, a light mid-tone, and on the dark side, a dark mid-tone. Now, on the cast shadow, the darkest part right next to the form is called an umbra. Most of the cast shadow is called a penumbra, It's kind of a mid-tone, not as dark as the umbra, just a little bit lighter than that. And the lightest part of the shadow is called the antumbra. That's where the shadow kind of gradually moves towards the light. And now we know how to shade a sphere. Shading the sphere is actually the hardest part. It's a little bit easier to shade the other shapes. The easiest shape of all to shade is the cube. So when I draw a cube, I'm just going to freehand it for a minute with a lighter pencil just to put the basic shape down. And then I can use a straight edge of some kind, a ruler, if you happen to have one, to make the edges just how I want them. Now I'm kind of going quickly here, so it's not exactly perfect. But it'll do for my demonstration. Now that I've drawn the outline of the shape, I need to decide where the light source is so I can see which side of the shape is going to be dark and which side is light. Now on this cube I can see three planes, three sides of the cube. The plane away from the light source is going to be the darkest plane, and then the plane closest on the top, in this case, to the light source is going to be the lightest plane, and then there's going to be a plane with a midtone. Now, in this case, in order to show that each of these sides or planes of the cube is perfectly flat, I'm going to shade them all the same tone. When we did the sphere, we worried about blending from one tone to another, and here we want the darkest side to all be the same amount of dark, and the mid side to be all the same amount of mid tone, and the lightest side to be all the same amount of light. It doesn't none of these sides go from dark to light. They're all the same in order to illustrate that the cube is a flat plane and the light is hitting it in the same way. And we can add a cast shadow to this cube if we want. Now let's look at the cylinder. I'm going to draw two cylinders here, and I'm going quick now because I know you're getting bored, so they're not going to be the best looking cylinders you've ever seen, but I've drawn one on the right and one on the left. I'm going to shade this first cylinder in the wrong way, the way that I've seen students do it many times in the past. This is how you don't want to shade the cylinder. Notice that I've shaded the top plane dark to light. We don't want to do that for real because that plane is flat and the light should be hitting all of it the same way. Also, I'm shading the round side of the cylinder in the same way that I shaded the sphere, kind of blending dark to light in a round shape as we move towards the highlight. That's wrong too, because this isn't a sphere at all, so this doesn't look quite right. It's wrong. Here's how the cylinder should be shaded. The top of it should just be a flat plane, so whatever kind of light you make the top, it's just going to stay the same. And then the rest of the cylinder is shaded evenly from top to bottom. We're going to make part of it dark and part of it light, but it's going to be blended in a straight way. So the dark core edge is going to be a dark edge or a core shadow all the way up and down. And the midtones are going to go up and down in a straight fashion. And so are the highlights, because that's how we illustrate that a cylinder is a straight shape and it's just rounded in one dimension. So now we've learned how to shade a cylinder and a cube and a sphere. Good luck!